Yoonho didn't think anything Jinwoo did would ever surprise him again. By the way, Yoonho wanted to ask Jinwoo one last thing before leaving the island. He looked at Jinwoo with curiosity, wondering about what was next. So what about Byung-woo, or really, that minion of his? What's going to happen to him now? Is he stuck being your soldier forever? Jinwoo simply shook his head in response. Yoonho smiled happily and said, "I'm glad you let him go. He never liked fighting anyway." Byung-woo would have been thankful for that. The group packed up their gear and headed off, ready for whatever came next. But for Jinwoo, a whole new adventure was just getting started. Just one more level to go until I hit 100. Jinwoo thought. With all the magic beasts around, reaching that goal shouldn't be tough. Plus there were tons of shadows in the ant cave waiting to be extracted. Time to get to work. He grinned and summoned Keizel. Meanwhile at the Hunters Association of Japan, President Matsumoto sighed and turned off the big screen. A hunter from Korea had just taken down a monster that 10 of Japan's top hunters couldn't defeat. How was that even possible? How is this even possible? He tugged at his thinning hair on the sides of his head. Something shocking had happened. Japan's power had been cut by more than half because of this incident. And now his position as president of the association was on shaky ground. If Korea had messed up their mission, he could have asked other countries for help to fix this crisis. The Korean hunters had just pulled off an amazing win. They not only defeated the queen but also managed to escape from the monstrous king and his huge army of thousands of ants. One hunter stood out above the rest. Jinwoo Sung. This single hunter had completely ruined the king's plans. President Matsumoto couldn't stop thinking about Jinwoo Sung. He remembered a phone call he'd had with Ryuji while Jinwoo was in Korea. There's an incredible hunter here," Ryuji had said. "Better than you?" Matsumoto had asked, sounding surprised. "Possibly," Ryuji had replied. There had been a long silence before Ryuji added, "We might need to change our plans." If only Matsumoto had listened to Ryuji back then. Ryuji was super good at figuring out how strong other hunters were, better than anyone else actually. And this was the first time he'd ever given a Korean hunter props. How could I have been so cocky? If they had really studied Jinwoo's skills and worked with Korea, none of this mess would have happened. In fact, if Japan had just stayed out of Korea's way, Korea might have handled the whole thing on their own. President Matsumoto basically created his own problems by trying to pull a fast one. "Mr. President." One of his staff members called out nervously, noticing how pale he looked. President Matsumoto waved them off without even looking up, just wanting to be left alone. The employee bowed quickly and left in a rush. President Matsumoto's face turned serious. He knew there was only one way to fix this problem. To save the Hunters Association of Japan, he needed someone special, and that someone was Jinwoo Sung. No matter what it took, Jinwoo had to join them. He was their only hope. Since Ryuji had lost his life in vain, this was their only chance to bring the organization back to life. With Jinwoo Sung now a household name across Korea, recruiting him wouldn't be simple, but there was hope after all. Another S-rank hunter from Korea had been lured away by a different country before. President Matsumoto pushed aside his doubts and started brainstorming again. On the eastern coast of the United States, Ursin's phone wouldn't stop ringing, cutting through the silence like an urgent call to action. David Brannon had had enough and finally answered the phone. Who could be calling at such a ridiculous hour? David was in charge of the Hunter Command Center, the most powerful group in America. If this was some kind of prank, he vowed to track down the caller and make them pay. "Hello," he growled. "Sir, it's me," said a familiar voice. David sat up straight, suddenly wide awake. "Assistant Director, what are you doing calling at this ungodly hour? You have to see this," the voice replied urgently. "See what?" David asked, confusion creeping in. He checked his phone and noticed he'd missed 7 calls, and there was a mysterious video file waiting for him. David had missed the calls because his phone was on mute.
"Understood. I'll call you back after I take a look." "No need, sir. What do you mean? I'm already outside your house." "What?" David bolted upright in bed and glanced at his bedside clock. It was 4:12 a.m. way too early. He tossed his phone aside and raced to the window. There, parked right in front of his house, was the assistant director's car.
The assistant director thumbed a quick wave when their eyes met. David turned away from the window, his eyes wide with shock. What in the world? Something big must have happened. He held his phone tight and clicked play to see what was going on. The video ended, And he froze. It showed an intense raid happening in a small country far to the east. David, the director of the Hunter Command Center, was shocked by what he saw. "What do you think?" his assistant director asked quietly. "Is there even anything to say?" David replied without hesitation. "You're here this late because you knew exactly how I'd react." He was right. After all, it wasn't every day that the director and assistant director of the Hunter Command Center had a meeting at 4 a.m. in the director's kitchen. The two men sat silently at opposite ends of the table. David lit a cigarette and watched the video again, puffing slowly as he thought it over. Even after watching it again, the video was super cool. David couldn't stop grinning when the hunter called forth shadow soldiers to fight those pesky ants. It felt like he was right there in the action. The director's wife popped her head upstairs, looking around curiously. "Hey Dave, everything okay down here?" she asked. He just waved her back up without a word. She nodded, looking worried. After smoking his third cigarette, he spoke in a hushed tone. "He's way too talented for a small place like South Korea." "I know," she agreed. "Do we know anything about him?" The assistant director pulled out a folder full of details about Jinwoo. The director flipped through the pages quickly, a satisfied smile spreading across his face. "Good," he said. It had only been about an hour since the raid on Jinj Island ended. But here he was, already knowing everything about Jinwoo. The file was super detailed, with everything about Jinwoo from what kind of hunter he was to who he knew. That's how strong the United States is. The assistant director just smiled quietly. They got lucky. Their intelligence network was impressive, but they also got lucky this time because of what happened with Il Won Sung before. They were confused about something they found in a dungeon. Was it human, or some kind of monster? This mysterious person claimed he was a hunter from South Korea. The team kept all the details they'd gathered about him. Right then, nobody outside Korea had a clue who he was, or what he was called. America was 2 steps ahead of everyone else. God bless the United States of America. The assistant director couldn't help thinking they had luck on their side. Success isn't just about luck, it's about making the most of it. But turning luck into opportunity takes effort. The assistant director looked serious and said, "He lost his dad in an accident at the gate, and didn't get the help he needed." Someone muttered. The director continued. "Before he came back, he almost died many times trying to earn money for his mom's hospital bills." "That's terrible," someone replied. "A hero who fought magic beasts for his country, had his widow and son neglected. That's just not right." Something no one saw coming happened in the United States. "Also, this is just a rumor," said the assistant director quietly. The director looked up from the papers he was reading. He hasn't joined any guild yet. The director's eyes widened in surprise. This was some serious news. He closed the file and said, "This situation is nothing like what happened with Dong So-hong." At the mention of that name, the assistant director's expression changed, a mix of confusion and curiosity. "Stealing 2 top-level hunters from the same country. That's like betraying our own allies," someone said, frowning at the idea. South Korea had been friends with the US for a long time, so anything they did would stir up big trouble. But the assistant director wasn't backing down. "Is he really worth all this?" the director asked hesitantly. The assistant just nodded confidently. The director knew he was right and couldn't argue against it. So the director asked, "Can you really pull this off?" The assistant gave the same reply as before when he was sent to bring in Dong So-hong. "I'll give it my all," he said with a determined smile. That's exactly what got him his job in the first place. This wasn't new territory for him. The US already had 2 top hunters who were super skilled and nationally recognized. But the director was really keen on bringing this guy over too. As he lit his 4th cigarette, he exclaimed, "Give him whatever he wants. Just bring him to me," Jinwoo said as he soared through the air on Kaisal's back. He was busy hunting down every last ant that had managed to escape his shadow soldiers. With a quick flick of his wrist, another ant met its end. Skewered by Jinwoo's dagger, the blade flew straight and true before returning to his hand without missing a beat, thanks to his ruler's hand ability. The battlefield was quieting down fast. "I think it's almost time for me to level up," Jinwoo muttered under his breath. He could feel the power surging inside him, ready to push him closer to his goal, reaching level 100. Just a few more ants and he'd be there. This place wasn't so bad after all. It might just be the perfect spot to make that final leap. Jinwoo had a soft spot for numbers that were multiples of 5, so the number 100 was extra special to him. Right now though, he wasn't booked for any gates, which meant he couldn't earn experience points in the usual way. His only hope was getting lucky, maybe finding a key in a random box or having a dungeon break happen nearby. But wait, lucky might not be the right word for a dungeon break. After all, those only occurred if at least one strike squad failed during a raid. In the end, it worked out best for everyone that he reached level 100 this way. But there was something else on his mind. When he tried to extract Bai Ungu's shadow, a painful memory popped up. Jinwoo had failed twice before, when trying to get Barca's shadow, who was the boss of the Ice Slayers. So when his first attempt at extracting Bai Ungu's shadow didn't work, he couldn't help but worry he'd fail again. But somehow he nailed it on the second try. After all, if at first you don't succeed, you try again. Of course, there were no guarantees he'd succeed with the Ant King's shadow, especially since the Ant's powers were way stronger than Bai Ungu's. Jinwoo really wanted to level up, even just once, to improve his odds of surviving this mission. Suddenly something grabbed his attention, and he signaled Kaisel to land.
On, Kree.
The winged creature slowed its flapping wings and touched down gently. Jinwoo hopped off to check the area. It should be somewhere around here, Jinwoo muttered to himself. He pushed through the bushes, frowning each time he found another dead body scattered on the ground. The bodies of Japanese hunters were strewn across the ground. Some had no heads at all, and others were so badly damaged they were impossible to recognize. Jinwoo studied them carefully. Wow, this must have taken some serious magic, he thought. These were top-tier hunters, not the kind you'd expect to meet their end in a place like this. Yet here they were, brutally slaughtered. This had to be the work of that giant mutant ant. Jinwoo couldn't think of any other culprit. The first time the ant had attacked him, it had slammed into his head so hard that his jaw still hurt just thinking about it. It was probably strong enough to knock someone off their feet with a single hit. Jinwoo walked around the area, feeling frustrated, then stopped suddenly. There was something strange here. He crouched down to investigate the ground more closely. The air was thick with the smell of blood, and the ground felt sticky beneath Jinwoo's feet. He could sense the magic energy left behind something familiar. It belonged to Ryuji Goto. But when Jinwoo looked around, there was no sign of him. It seemed like the giant ant had completely taken over Ryuji's body. Jinwoo sighed, shaking his head in frustration as he stood up. The strongest hunter in Japan was dead. His shadow soldiers who had gone after the remaining ants told him they were finished. That's it. Most people from Korea would celebrate this news, but Jinwoo looked disappointed. This meant he wouldn't be able to level up. Since there were no living magic beasts left, Jinwoo figured he might as well head back to the ant cave to extract shadows from that monstrous ant and its queen. But then he stopped. Wait a second, could there still be some magic beasts around? His sharp senses picked up on something promising, actually, quite a few things. His disappointment vanished, replaced by excitement. He hopped onto Castle's back. Let's go. It turned out Jinwoo was right. A huge smile spread across Jinwoo's face as he stepped into the spawning grounds. The room was packed with eggs every inch of the floor. Walls, pillars, and even the ceiling was covered in them. You could see something moving inside each translucent shell, proving these were definitely living magic beasts. Jinwoo wondered how much experience he could gain from all these eggs. They might just be enough to level up. He called out his shadow soldiers, especially those good at hitting multiple targets at once. Alright, he said. Fang and 3 mage soldiers stood ready, lined up in order of rank. Jinwoo carefully examined each of the 4 soldiers one by one. Then he placed the sphere of avarice in Fang's hand. You know what to do, right? He asked. The soldiers nodded, and Jinwoo pointed at the eggs. Begin. Suddenly, flames erupted from Fang's gaping mouth, and the mage soldiers started hurling fireballs everywhere. Karakum! A kaboom! A boom! A boom! A boom! A kaboom! The eggs didn't stand a chance, they were instantly burned to ashes. Karaboom! A boom! Noticed some ant pupae hiding in one corner. Check this out. The poopy shells were gone, revealing almost full-grown ants inside. But all of them were dead. Each one had wings. What if these creepy critters had lived? They could have grown up, and maybe even crossed the ocean with that giant ant leading the way. Even defeating the queen wouldn't have saved Korea or Japan from the mess that followed. Jinwoo was super relieved. He could finally put an end to things here and now. Kaboom! Upboom! His soldiers were dripping with sweat, so he decided it was time to bring out the Demon Monarch's sword from his inventory. He thought to himself, why not give this a try? The sword was awesome, glowing with a bright blue light and crackling with electricity. Every time he swung it, he had stashed it away after defeating the Demon Monarch in that creepy demon's castle. He grabbed the sword because of its cool magic powers, not his usual daggers. Jinwoo slammed it with all his strength. A storm of blue lightning lit up the room.
Whoa! Jinwoo exclaimed, thrilled. The sword wasn't as powerful as when the Demon Monarch used it, but it was strong enough to burn those eggs. Too cool to leave unused. He preferred daggers, but it was worth pulling out sometimes. Ugh, how long had he been dealing with these eggs?
Finally, Jinwoo heard the best sound ever. Epping, you have leveled up. Jinwoo pumped his fist in excitement. He stored the Demon Monarch's sword in his inventory and headed toward the Queen's den, leaving his soldiers to wrap things up at the spawning grounds. When he arrived, the giant monstrous ant was still lying right where it had died. Jinwoo stood over its lifeless body, a big grin spreading across his face. After all that hard work, this was one cool reward. Jinwoo's heart raced. He really wanted the shadow of an ant to make it his soldier, but then he remembered how important it was to stay focused. He had learned that when he took someone else's shadow before. I need to calm down, Aze told himself. He took deep breaths, slowing his heart down until it wasn't racing anymore. Then with a steady gaze he looked at the ant's tiny body. Okay. Aze Jinwoo was ready. He looked at the ground, focused and steady. Whoa. Jinwoo had never seen anything like this before. Thick, dark clouds of smoke shot up from the Ant King's body like giant mushrooms. This was way scarier than any enemy he'd faced so far. The Ant King must have been super powerful. Jinwoo stared at the smoking beast and wondered what was going on. Then he reached out his hand and said, Araz. Suddenly, everything around him started flickering between light and dark, like a broken light bulb about to burn out. It was super creepy. Jinwoo looked up. The big orb of light Zhongin had created during the attack on the Queen was flickering. And is the magic fading already? Jinwoo wondered. That was his first thought. But he knew they'd only been in the den for about 20 minutes. So why would the spell be weakening so fast? Plus, it was a powerful magic spell cast by an S-rank mage hunter to help the raid go smoothly for him and his team. So there's no way the magic would fade this quickly. Could it be? Jinwoo wondered if the flickering was caused by shadow extraction. The area was suddenly swallowed by darkness. Even with his sharp perception, which should let him see in the dark, as long as there was a sliver of light, he couldn't see anything. It was pitch black. It probably lasted only a second. In just a moment, the darkness faded into light, and Jinwoo found himself face to face with a massive ant. He jumped back, startled. If he hadn't heard the notification saying the extraction was successful, he might have attacked, thinking the monstrous ant had somehow come back to life. Man, that scared me half to death. Jinwoo sighed in relief. Once he calmed down, he took a closer look at the ant from a safe distance. This wasn't the same creature he'd faced before. Something about it was different. Dark smoke swirled around him, curling into twisted shapes as it rose into the air. Jinwoo stared at the shadow of the Ant King in awe. Something about it felt different now, like its presence was even more intimidating than before. He couldn't tell exactly how the ant's powers had changed, but one thing was clear: this fearsome creature now belonged to him. Jinwoo stood tall, facing his new shadowy soldier. Inside he could feel a surge of powerful magic coursing through the ant, and it hit him this towering, menacing being was his. He tried to act cool, but he couldn't help grinning from ear to ear. It was like getting the ultimate gift he'd always wanted. Thump thump. His heart raced with excitement. Then, just as suddenly as it had begun, everything calmed down. The shadow's info flashed in front of him, and Jinwoo leaned in, ready to see what his new ally was capable of. Jinwoo narrowed his eyes as he read the strange words hovering above the shadow's head. LV, 1 General Rank He's. His face lit up with a grin when he saw the soldier's rank. It was one he'd never seen before, which meant this guy was way stronger than any of his other soldiers. Considering how tough this soldier must have been when he was alive, it made sense. Just looking at the rank, Jinwoo knew right away that this wasn't some ordinary soldier. Jinwoo's efforts felt even more rewarding after that. Then, shuff, as he locked eyes with Jinwoo, the shadow dropped down on one knee. Like the other soldiers, this one was completely loyal to him. Nice. Jinwoo turned around, ready to take out the queen ant next. When, my king? Azru froze at the voice behind him. He wasn't someone who scared easily, but his heart nearly stopped. Was that a voice he just heard? He turned around. But he already knew the truth. There was only one energy signal, and it belonged to the shadow ant. Jinwoo stayed on one knee with his head down. Slowly, he looked up. Did you do that? He asked. The shadowy figure opened its mouth again. Need a name, it said, its voice shaky but clear. Meanwhile, a helicopter carrying hunters zoomed towards Seoul. It landed on the roof of the Hunters Association. With a thud-tum-tum-tump, President Go hurried to open the door, looking worried. How is Hunter Chan? He asked. The hunters glanced at her. She was lying unconscious on the floor, covered by a blanket. Quickly! President Go shouted. Two top healers rushed in. They looked confused and exchanged glances. What's wrong? President Go asked. She has no injuries. One healer said. Everything seems normal. The other added. President Go frowned. So you're saying Hunter Chan doesn't need treatment? The healers nodded, explaining further. I have no idea who did this, but someone used some seriously strong healing magic on her. President Go said, looking totally baffled. There's nothing left for us to do here. He had been super worried when he saw how badly hurt she looked during the live broadcast. He'd even gotten a report saying she was out cold and in rough shape. That's why he'd rushed to find two of the best healers around and brought them to help. But now it turns out she doesn't even need treatment. President Go gave her a thorough once-over, trying to make sense of it all. Her face looked calm, like she was just resting. But something felt off, like no one really knew what had happened while the camera wasn't rolling. He tilted his head, confused. There were no other healers left. Bai Ongu, their only healer, had died in a terrible way. He turned to Dongwook, the team leader. What happened, Ma? He asked. Dongwook hesitated, unsure of how to explain. Before he could say anything, one of the A-rank healers called out. Hunter Chas is waking up. Everyone's eyes snapped toward her at once. President Go, who had been sitting quietly beside Hain, leaned in and asked, Hunter Chas, how are you feeling? Hain slowly opened her eyes. Where? You're inside a helicopter that landed at the Hunters Association. You'll be taken to a hospital soon. Hospital? Am took a deep breath. Looking around slowly, the air smelled like Jinwoo. She turned to President Go with half-open eyes. Was Hunter Sung here? The other hunters were shocked. They knew Jinwoo had arrived after Ham passed out. President Go nodded slowly instead of answering her. Han gave a small smile. I knew it, she thought. It wasn't a dream. Then Han fell back into a deep sleep. After checking that her breathing was steady, President Go told his team to take her to the hospital so she could rest properly. That's when he noticed Jinwoo was nowhere to be found. He looked at Dongwook again. So where is Hunter Sung? Yunho jumped into the conversation. Hunter Sung wanted to stay behind. President Go looked confused. He knew the helicopter they came in was special. It had a mana-powered engine and flew straight here from Jeju Island without making any stops. So, how could Jinwoo have stayed somewhere else? President Go asked again, his voice filled with confusion. Where on earth do you mean? President Go asked, sounding worried. Yunho let out an awkward chuckle and nodded. Yes, Hunter Sung still had some business to take care of on Jeju Island, so he never got on the helicopter at all. The shadow ant answered all of Jinwoo's questions, but its responses weren't much help.